Mike, I think a word that we're going to hear in much detail in coming months is this word clusters or clustering. So essentially we now have the announcement of the clustering of generation units.
Yeah.
What does this mean and how is it going to improve matters?
So clustering refers to grouping generating power stations into 3 units, as the Minister announced, which would be able to compete on equal foot. In other words, the mix within that would be the similar mix of old and new plant and the type of plant, like peaking plant and so on.
So I'm power station 1 and I have a particular method of generation. I would then be competing with somebody else.
Yeah, so you'll be in a cluster.
Yeah.
So the cluster, it consists of a number of units together. So you've got power stations that are clustered together and they create the cluster.
They would be clustered geographically?
Well, no, not. They'll be clustered, I would believe, in terms of making sure that the 3 clusters have an equal balance of peaking, base load, and other plants, so that they can compete against each other. 3 different companies.
That's easy to achieve, is it?
No, it's not. It's going to take time. It's a good idea, but it's going to take time. The biggest issue for me in everything that I've heard today is that the objectives and the ambitions set by the Minister and government, I think, are honourable, and I would support them. But they are confusing, completely confusing. There's plans and there's implementation. The Minister made the point about implementation, but the extent to which we understand the implementation of all of this is confusing. I see 5 things, only 5 things. Firstly, Eskom's operations and costs are out of control. Eskom must be basically charged to fix it up, and they must be focused on that and that alone. Get their operations and costs under control. Secondly, the issue about unbundling transmission and clustering, as you refer to generation, is a completely different issue. A separate implementation agency should be put into that, not Eskom and certainly not government.
Why not?
Because they don't have the skills and the experience to do this. This is a major undertaking. So you need a very specialized project management office to take that up. Thirdly, the IRP implementation thereof can be handed to the Independent Power Producers Office, the IPP office, which exists. So the implementation of the IPP can simply be handed to them. Eskom's debt, the Minister has already announced Treasury will look after that. There's a 5th component of implementation, and very little has been spoken about that today. That's the demand cycle. They need to understand what's happened to the demand of electricity. Very little has been spoken about that. And the 2 big entities that can speak to that is the EIUG and SALGA. Together they represent most of the consumption in the country. They need to be engaged. So those are the 5 issues, all of which need to have an implementation focus rather than a planning focus.
The Minister in this cluster strategy is talking about the unhealthy nature of monopoly, that by going with this particular method, it is going to have an impact on culture and on pricing.
Yeah.
Ultimately, as we get that competition mechanism going, is that going to have a positive impact on you and me as consumers of electricity, given, as you've mentioned and as the Minister mentioned, the price of electricity has spiraled out of control?
Correct. No, it will definitely have a benefit for South Africans at large, yourself and myself. But it comes back to implementation. The implementation needs to be handled very, very professionally. And as I said, the implementation of the unbundling and clustering should not be handed over to Eskom or any government agency. It should be a proper project management office. Then it would work.
I'm going to ask you to hold for just a moment, Mike. I want to return back to that briefing. Our reporter, Maloko Moloto, is now standing by with the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan. Maloko, let's hand it over to you. All right, Maloko just getting himself ready for that broadcast. I understand that he's got the Public Enterprises Minister, Pravin Gordhan, with him. As soon as he's stopped moving around, we will get back to him. In the meantime, though, back to this clustering if we can. So a lot of it is contingent on the power station managers themselves. That's what I was hearing.
Key players.
How are they up to it? How are they going to guarantee competitive pricing and efficiency?
It's interesting you ask. Going right back to the 1990s, early 2000s, Eskom effectively were operating like this. In other words, devolved authority and accountability to the power stations. It worked very well. In fact, very few people know this, but in 2001, Eskom was voted the best managed utility in the world because of this. In other words, power stations were autonomous. The power station managers were given the authority and responsibility. So my personal view is at a power station level, they will welcome this.
All right, Mike, you're going to just have to bear with me because we're making this up as we go along. I think we can go back now to Moloko Moloto, and you have Minister Pravin Gordhan with you. Moloko, I hope you've stopped moving around. You can hear me now. Let's pick it up with the Minister.
Well, the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, today presented what is called the roadmap for Eskom in a reformed electricity supply industry. Essentially, the minister here, when he was addressing the media, he outlined a document which he says will be guiding the unbundling of the electricity supplier. We know Eskom supplies 90 to 95% of electricity to South Africans, and a lot of people have actually admitted that in its current state, Eskom is essentially one of the biggest threat to our economy. Now, we know that with its debt of approximately 450 billion rand and the operational challenges plaguing the utility, government admits that actually it is difficult to manage Eskom in its current form. It is just too big to manage. So the minister today announced that it's going to be separated into three entities. One is going to be generation. Essentially, with generation, the minister said there's going to be a cluster of three energy plants or power plants, and those plants will be generating, each clusters will be generating electricity, and they will be selling, they will be competing. That's worth pointing out. And after generating that electricity, they must sell to another part of Eskom that's going to be transmission. Now, transmission is going to have its own separate board of directors, and of course more details on how it's going to be running will be provided at a later stage. Now, transmission will buy from either of those three clusters of power plants which will be producing electricity on the basis of competition. Now, there's going to be a third entity which is distribution. The minister did not necessarily give much details with regard to distribution, primarily because there is a feasibility study that says still needs to be done, because currently you have Eskom itself and municipalities who are distributing this particular electricity which they buy, of course, which is generated by Eskom currently. But I'm hoping to speak to the minister here. He is just busy. Of course, some of the questions that we would want to hear from him is what gives him confidence that unbundling Eskom in the particular manner that they have announced will work efficiently compared to the current state, because anyway this will remain the same company. There will be, all these entities will be reporting to Eskom Holdings Company.
All right, Moloko, while we're waiting for the minister then, I'll get back to Mike Rousseau in just a moment. But again, back to the clustering of those generation units. Let's hear what the minister had to say a little earlier today.
So in the first instance, we say that the Eskom journey into the future is dependent on the integrated resource plan that Minister Mantashe approved on the basis of an approval from Cabinet about 10 days or so. And this plan indicates the kind of energy mix that South Africa foresees for itself for the next 10 years. In other words, how much of hydro or nuclear or renewables or solar, coal, and any other form of energy that could contribute to the energy mix in South Africa, and how that mix will change over time. as we go through this journey over the next decade or so. The second thing that this paper points out is how the transmission component will be separated. So firstly, it's looking after this infrastructure in transmission. Secondly, it's a systems operator. This is the team that decides how much of power is demanded at any point in time and how much of power is available from the different generation sources that energy is produced in. Thirdly, it has and will have a buying component, and this buying component will from day to day decide how much of energy does it want to, inverted commas, buy from Eskom generation, how much of energy is it taking from renewables that are currently in existence or will be in existence in the future, or from time to time, if it wants to buy power from the private sector, at what price would it actually buy it as well? So there's a buying function.
Oh, so let's take this a little further then, Mike. So what then are the setup mechanics as far as this clustering is concerned? Is this a fairly easy thing to achieve?
It's not easy at all, because obviously there's a whole bunch of regulations and legal aspects that have to be dealt with. It's doable, but it will take time.
But how much time, though? I mean, given the urgency of the crisis.
My sense is the clustering itself will at least 2 years, depending on a whole bunch of issues. But it's not going to happen in a few months, that's for sure.
Is there likely to be resistance to this?
I suspect there will.
Where would that come from?
I suspect the unions, mostly.
Because of what? I mean, is there a concomitant loss of jobs here as a result of that?
As the Minister correctly pointed out, they see this as privatization, which it's not. It's not at all. All you're doing is you're just putting the generation plants in a different cluster, but in the end analysis, it's still owned by government, so nothing changes there. But unfortunately, a lot of this stuff is misunderstood. And I think that's where the resistance comes from.
All right, 2 years down the line, let's assume that this has been optimally set up, right? Then it depends on the strategy of buying from these different units.
Yeah.
It's contingent on what you've termed a buying office.
Yes.
What would that buying office be constructed like, and how would they determine where to purchase electricity?
Yeah, look, such a buying office already exists in the form of two entities. The one is the system operator, which is currently under Eskom. It's an office that exists physically there, bricks and mortar, it's all there, and the IPP office. So the system operator buys on a hourly, daily basis, where the IPP office is set up to procure new generation in the longer term. Those two entities can be looked at and set up very efficiently to provide this function that the Minister refers to.
And quickly, we would have the right skills in place to do that.
Oh yes, they exist, yes. And the systems exist, yeah.
All right. Obviously, this is a huge political issue as well. So we're going to go to Parliament now. In fact, we're not going to go to Parliament. We want to get some political reaction to that. But jumping ahead of the queue is the Public Enterprises Minister himself, Pravin Gordhan, who I understand is now with my colleague Moloto at GCIS in Pretoria. Moloko, he's finished that important phone call. Let's pick it up with the Minister if we can.
Hello, Jeremy Max. Yes, indeed, we are joined by Minister of Public Enterprises, Minister Pravin Gordhan. Minister, thank you so much for making time. You presented this special document, which essentially announces the unbundling of Eskom. Now, you did speak about the fact that one of the entities, the transmission, will have its own board. What's going to happen to the others, particularly distribution as well as generation? Are you also going to have boards of directors and CEOs in all those three entities?
Well, that's somewhere into the future. So let's start at the beginning. This is not just about unbundling. It's about taking the energy industry in South Africa into a new direction. It's basing it on the integrated resource plan, which says that the energy mix of South Africa is going to change over the next 10 years. It is also meeting a commitment that the President made that we will say, where are we taking Eskom into the future? And in doing so, how do we get it out of crisis mode into a more stable form so that future generations can say we've left a good utility behind? So that's the first point. The second point is, as part of the change in the business model, as you correctly point out, the process of separating transmission, which we've talked about before, is starting, and we will we've got the broad plans and we've got some timetables to work with, and Eskom will then talk to Labour about the issues that are involved there, so that it will ensure that we secure the transmission part of Eskom. It will have an interim board shortly, so that their responsibility is going to be to fully implement that component. The new component that we're introducing is that in monopolies it's important to have competition. If you don't have competition, you don't get the right price for whatever it is that you are producing. So on the generation side, we are saying explore the possibility of taking the 15 or 16 coal power stations and breaking them up into clusters, and then let them compete. It won't happen tomorrow morning. It'll happen over a period of time. Let them compete about who actually produces the cheapest electricity. Because what South Africans want, whether they are students at home or households that have to pay for electricity, or small businesses or the bigger mines and industries that we have to service, is cheaper electricity or cost-effective electricity.
But somebody would ask, Minister, that when you say on the component of generation you're going to have 3 clusters of power plants that are going to compete in terms of generating electricity, what kind of competition is this when you have Eskom on itself competing with itself? I mean,
there are lots of examples around the world. So we've been studying examples in Vietnam and in other places, and Vietnam is very similar to us in terms of the amount of energy or electricity that the industry requires. It took them eventually 20 years to bring about this transformation. So I think it's important for your viewers to also know that this is not a quick fix that we're talking about. Step by step, each of these things will be done, and they have actually introduced competition, and it can work.
Another important thing that you made mention of, Minister, is that Eskom is actually looking at developing its own renewable energy plants. And your fellow Minister Mantashe a few weeks back said that actually coal is here to stay. Another point that you acknowledged during your presentation. Why is government not operating its own mining companies, especially given the fact that coal suppliers are just increasing prices ridiculously?
Well, that's his terrain, so I'm not going to enter into coal mining. But what I want to say is that, sorry, what was your earlier question?
My question really is, what is so difficult with government going into coal mining? Yeah.
No, so if you look at the integrated resource plan, it says very clearly that coal is around for the next 20, 30 years. Because you've just constructed or finished constructing Medupi, for example. It has a lifespan of 40 or 50 years ahead of it. And it's the coal-based power station, unless we do something else with it sometime into the future. I don't think I'll be around at that.
But will government really ever operate its own coal mining company in order to...
The government has a state-owned mining company. I think it has some investment in coal, but that's not the key issue. The key issue is, right now it's the private sector that supplies coal, and they must supply coal at a reasonable price. And we've agreed, Minister Mantashe, myself, and the mining sector, that we want to index coal. So there are different types of coal, and we want to get a reasonable price for each type of coal. So you make a reasonable profit, and Eskom gets a fair price to actually pay. We can't have exorbitant prices being charged and then say Eskom doesn't work, right? Or Eskom's debt is increasing too much. So all of us, whether you are a coal miner, whether you are a component supplier, or whatever the case might be, all of us will have to contribute by shedding some of the excessive costs that we impose on Eskom in order for Eskom to become viable.
A final one, Minister. You are in negotiations with the independent power producers to reduce their prices. Given the fact that contracts have been signed already, do you admit that you are negotiating on a back foot here? Should they refuse flatly to reduce their prices? Do you agree that there's nothing else you can do?
No, that's not true. It's been done elsewhere in the world as well. So that's why it's useful to know what happens elsewhere. In Germany, in Spain, you see the earlier rounds of renewable technology were very expensive. The current availability of that technology is very cheap. So what we are saying is not take a loss, but come to an arrangement with government which will ensure that you still make your profit, but you'll make it over a longer period of time, or find some other formula so that effectively what is being charged to the consumer from the renewables supply is lower than what we pay.
But if they refuse to reduce their prices, what's your
recourse? We'll worry about that when it comes. So don't talk about the obstruction. Let's talk about a constructive spirit in which we've started the negotiations, and I'm confident that we'll come up with an answer.
Thank you very much. Minister Pravin Gordhan, responsible for public enterprises. Of course, he wants all of us to be the prisoners of hope. We can only hope that this vital entity that's responsible for our economy will turn the corner. Back to you, Jeremy.
All right, Moloko Moloto, thank you very much indeed. As the Minister was saying a little earlier today, fixing Eskom is not like changing a tyre. It is a protracted process. Now, inevitably, there's going to be much political reaction over the next 24 hours. Let's dip our toe into that right now. Let me take you to Parliament. We've already garnered two political parties, the Freedom Front Plus and the Democratic Alliance. Lindsay Dentlinger in Parliament, good afternoon to you. You have a representative, I understand, from the FF Plus.
Good afternoon, Jeremy. Yes, I do. A little earlier, as you've mentioned, I spoke to the DA's Natasha Mazzoni and the Freedom Front Plus here with me, pretty much sharing a lot of the same view that Minister Pravin Gordhan has really just not gone far enough with this paper, not said all the things they want to hear. I don't know if you first want to have a listen to what Natasha Mazzoni told me a little earlier before I speak to voter vessels from the Freedom Front Plus.
Here's the problem. It's much of the same. You know, we're talking about unbundling a company, but essentially what you're doing is you're taking one company, you're splitting it into three, but the mother body is going to be the same. And we have a fundamental problem with it. We're saying that's part of the issue here. The endemic problems at Eskom are the fact that it is this huge, gigantic monopoly that has a stranglehold on the South African economy. And until we break that, we're going to be stuck in the same position going forward, paying out billions and billions of bailouts. And the company is never going to self-rectify. It cannot in the current structure that it finds itself.
That's the view from the Democratic Alliance's Natasha Mazzoni. The Finance Minister Tito Mboweni says Pravin Gordhan is likely to make announcements on Eskom's debt at the mini-budget. That takes place tomorrow. Much of this plan obviously contingent on money. Lindsay Dentlinger, back to you. What does the Freedom Front Plus have to say?
Yes, Jeremy, I'm going to get straight into it here with Mr. Voter Wessels from the Freedom Front Plus. Mr. Wessels, your thoughts on what the Minister has unveiled in that plan?
Well, there's some positives, but most of the positives, such as utilizing coal plants for other purposes and switching to cheaper coal, utilizing alternative energy, it's positive, but it's a long-term plan. It won't solve the crisis, the acute crisis we are facing now.
So what would you like to see in the short term? What is the plan to fix that acute crisis?
Well, I think he should have announced far further implications with regards to unbundling and going further into privatization, but we know that he is being held ransom by the ideology of the ANC, but also by the unions and the alliance partners not allowing that to happen. Also restructuring Eskom in the short term, getting rid of staff members that are not core staff members, essential staff members. The salary bill of Eskom is much too high, and that must be addressed. And addressing the debt of Eskom is not going to be a short-term plan. So, and especially with him saying that we will be recovering the outstanding debt from municipalities starting tomorrow, how is it going to do that? Because municipalities are bankrupt. So we need a further plan and something concrete and substantial to address that.
Also starting tomorrow, the Minister says the unbundling of Eskom, starting with the transmission aspect of that business. Is that the right place to start?
We think it shouldn't only be unbundling, it should be privatization, and especially not transmission, but rather power generation. And we say that introducing more competition in the power generation market will solve our energy crisis. Why can't we have private power generators supplying energy into the grid? So there must be deregulation, and there must be competition with regards to that, and privatize the generation of power. That's what we need.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wessels. Jeremy, so as you hear there, a fairly lukewarm response so far. I'm sure political parties still digesting what the Minister had to say, and this afternoon we are expecting some of the board members from Eskom to appear before Parliament's Appropriations Committee, and as you say, just a day before we expect the Finance Minister also to make some key pronouncements on this giant problem that government is facing, which is Eskom. Eskom.
All right, Lindsay Dentlinger in Parliament, thank you. Mike Rousseau, I want to end with you if I can, and maybe it's an interlinked question. On the one hand, we've got these entities that are going to start competing. I'd be interested to know what will drive that competition among them, and I think part of it would be contingent on Pravin Gordhan's call on the mining community to make, and I quote, a contribution to Eskom's cost-saving drive, suggesting suppliers were price gouging and should come in with lower supply prices. It would then be up to those power station managers, if I'm hearing you correctly, to make sure that they're going to compete on that level.
Yeah. So in the clustering, you break the stranglehold of Eskom's monopoly buying. Eskom for a number of years now has had a central buying office which has self-serving purposes, and obviously we know with the state capture and so on, a lot of problems happen there. With the clustering, each cluster would then take responsibility for their procurement, and the efficient procurement thereof, which is a big benefit in terms of the costs coming in, would then basically be more efficient. And then secondly, the prices that they would charge have to be transparent, and we'd be able to see exactly what's going on in them and therefore create the competition that the Minister refers to.
I thank you for breaking all of this down for us today.
You're welcome.
Mike Rousseau, independent commentator on energy matters.